Quick, tell me who would win, the world's largest empire, covering 1/4 of the entire earth, or just a small island nation in Africa? If your guess is the British, damn, you're right. As this war lasted for only 38 minutes, being the shortest war in history. But what if we change that and Zanzibar managed to defeat the strongest nation on earth? And how could they? Let me tell you what I came up with. Zanzibar may seem insignificant, but they were quite important in the age of exploration due to their favorable location. Believe it or not, Oman once controlled Zanzibar, and they used to control a large chunk of coastal modern-day Tanzania. Zanzibar developed nicely due to slave trade, spices, etc. Many Indians fled to Zanzibar. Freddie Mercury is a famous Indian born in Zanzibar. I told you all of this because, as you may know, at the end of the 19th century, Britain controlled all of India and the United Kingdom considered all Indians to be British subjects. This is the reason why Britain was so interested in Zanzibar, as they had the perfect excuse to claim all of the island. The British couldn't conquer all of Oman without any backlash, so for now they would just establish naval presence. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, they wanted other nations to also stop using slave labor. In Zanzibar, there was a lot of slave trade and slave labor going on, which the British wanted to stop. This is because Indians, which the British considered as theirs, were usually the slaves on the island. In 1856, when Sultan Said bin Uthman died, there was a power struggle between two of his sons as to who would lead the empire. The British mediated the conflict and offered that one would get the Omani part while the other would get Zanzibar. They succeeded, and now Britain had split their rival in the region in two, making it easier to conquer them. In the 1870s, the British were slowly colonizing Zanzibar, leaving the Sultan to only rule the island. The Germans also started taking lands out of Zanzibar's colonial African possessions in 1890. The Zanzibari Sultan Ali bin Said realized that soon the British or the Germans would come to annex them. Sultan Ali decided to become a British protectorate, which would at least mean his nation wouldn't get invaded. The British wanted to outlaw slavery on the island, which was a massive problem since the slaves were the backbone of the economy on Zanzibar. Sultan Ali was resisting this decision for 3 years, which angered the British, so they wanted to replace him with someone who would comply. Due to a treaty that Zanzibar signed with Britain, when there is a succession crisis, the British can choose who would lead Zanzibar. When Sultan Ali died in 1893, there were many candidates for the throne, meaning that the British can choose someone to work with. Hamid bin Tuwayani was picked, but Prince Khalid ibn Barkash felt like he should be the ruler. So he went to the palace, barricaded himself inside and declared that he should be the ruler. The British managed to force him out, but there was a misunderstanding, as Khalid thought that he was the next in line while the British never said that he would rule the island. On the 25th of August 1896, this misunderstanding went violent as Britain invaded Zanzibar. This is because Hamid bin Tuwayani died mysteriously, so Khalid ibn Barkash presented himself as the ruler of Zanzibar. This was a problem since the British did not want Khalid, who also created a 1,000-man army loyal to him. The British again rejected Khalid, so he declared himself the Sultan and marched into the palace, calling his supporters for help. The place was fortified, so Khalid thought that he may have a chance in emerging victorious. What ended up happening is that hundreds were dead, the palace was destroyed, and the British won their easiest war, setting the record for the shortest war in history. At the time, nobody thought that there was going to be an actual war. After all, Khalid did this 3 years ago and was talked out of it, so why not again? On the other side, Khalid thought that the British would negotiate with him. One day before the conflict, Basil Cave was the British consul in Zanzibar at the time. He sent a message to the Prime Minister asking if they are allowed to bomb the palace if all other means of ending the dispute were unsuccessful. This was approved. Britain sent into the harbour many powerful gunboats, as well as around 1,000 well-trained British and pro-imperial Zanzibari forces. A message was sent to Khalid ordering him to leave the palace by 9 AM in the morning, or the British would declare war. On the 27th of August, Khalid was willing to negotiate, but wasn't willing to surrender. When he was asked to lower his flag from the palace, he said that he had no intentions of doing so. He also said that he didn't believe the British would open fire. He was very wrong. At 9 AM, the gunboats were ordered to open fire on the palace, which sat at the shore. The palace was a wooden structure, which just 2 minutes after the British opened fire had collapsed and was in flames. The Zanzibaris, who had a gunboat of their own, tried to attack the ships who opened fire, but their boat was almost sunk immediately. The British ships even stopped firing for a moment because they wanted to rescue the crew. After around 38 minutes, Khalid was missing and the palace was burning. 500 of his supporters were found dead. On the other hand, the British suffered only one wounded, not even a casualty. After the same evening, Hamoud bin Muhammad was formally made the Sultan of Zanzibar. as if almost nothing had happened that morning. As for Khalid, it seems like he had disappeared. This was until he was found in the German consulate. The British couldn't enter and arrest him, this is unless the Germans inside kicked him out. The Germans refused to do that because it would screw with their colonial rival, the British. What is interesting is that the Germans sent Khalid to Tanganyika, and in the First World War, when the British invaded, they captured Khalid almost 20 years later after he fled Zanzibar. Khalid was punished by being exiled to St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon Bonaparte was sent. So, 500 Zanzibari died in 38 minutes, with the British suffering only one wounded at a time. How can we possibly make Zanzibar win this conflict? And is the solution I came up with any realistic? To achieve that, one option is for Britain to accidentally bomb the German consulate, which would create a diplomatic crisis between Britain and Germany. If that were to happen, the Germans would like heavy reparations or starting a war. If this were to happen, it would be very interesting, as maybe Germany would get all of Zanzibar. After all, the Germans already had neighboring Tanganyika. This, however, wouldn't change much, as the Germans would still lose the First World War and Zanzibar would become British again. I think it's out of the question that Zanzibar emerges victorious just by force, as they didn't have many weapons and apparently one artillery piece that they used was more than 350 years old. Remember when Basil Cave, the British consul, sent a message to London requesting that they take aggressive actions towards Zanzibar? If the British refused for some reason, then Khalid could continue ruling Zanzibar for a couple of years, up until the British return, if they do, that is. It's unlikely that the British Parliament would just refuse free land, so we need to get more creative. Let's look at the British monarch, Queen Victoria. The year this scenario takes place is 1896, with her dying just 6 years later, in 1902. My realistic solution for Zanzibar winning is the death of Queen Victoria. This means that Basil Cave wouldn't be allowed to invade Zanzibar right now, and all gunboats must return to Britain. This is so they can mourn the Queen's death. Up until then, Queen Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history, who was loved by many people. Zanzibar would be spared, but they would realize that the British would eventually return. The British, however, wouldn't be interested anymore, as the German presence in the island increased. Many Germans even settled in the island. If Britain were to attack, this could provoke Germany, as for sure a few Germans would perish during the attacks. The Germans could have become protectorates over Zanzibar, but looking at the problems that this island nation created for Britain, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. Zanzibar was also using slave labor and slave trade, so the Germans didn't want to associate themselves with that. This is another reason why Germany wouldn't like to take Zanzibar. We're left with both Germany and Britain not wanting to take Zanzibar, which means that Zanzibar would become a free nation in Africa. The only free nations in the continent at the time were Liberia and Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia. It becomes quite difficult to predict how an independent Zanzibar would look like, but I have a few suggestions. Since Zanzibar was previously ruled by Oman, the rulers were Arabs, speaking the Arabic language. This was really different from the ethnic population of the island. Historically, in 1963, the Zanzibari Africans overthrew the Arabs, who were leading them, and then joined Tanganyika to form Tanzania. I would assume that Zanzibar remains Arabic in this timeline, and they would establish great relations with other Arabic nations after the First World War. Speaking of the Great War, I assume that if the League of Nations were created, Zanzibar would be forced to abolish their slave labor. I want to explore a very unrealistic option, and this is what if Britain had collapsed because they were defeated by tiny Zanzibar. All of the world would laugh and mock Britain, with the dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand drifting away from the British. They would denounce the British monarch as their head of state, formally declaring their independence. India would try the same, but the presence of the East India Company was too great. The whole of India couldn't become free at once, but millions would rebel who would secure their independent state in the coming years. By the time of the First World War, Britain might not even join, due to them combating the Indians. This would result in Germany most likely winning the First World War, just because Zanzibar won against the British. I hope you had a good laugh at this unrealistic option. I suggest you take a look at this scenario where I explore the future of the world up until the year of 2100. Hope to see you there.